Welcome to another broadcast of mindyourhealthcast.com. It's nice to be with you again, and I hope you've been following the last two broadcasts on the subject at hand, which has to do with the subjects of radionics, facts and fictions. There's a lot of controversy over the subject, and in this country you will hear very little, if anything, about it. It became a moot subject many years ago. I can only guess at the motivations behind it. One, of course, was the clash with scientism, the religion of science, who believes that whatever their position and their set of rules about anything is, that is the only one. And anything beyond that is heretical, and if they probably were in the position to do it, in many cases they might consider burning people at the stake or other harsh treatments, such as historically other groups have done when they were missionary in nature and considered that anyone who disagreed with them had to be wrong and evidently were possessed of the devil or following a path of unbelief, and therefore they needed to be disposed of. Now, they don't have that power, of course, today, but sometimes in listening to them and watch how angry they get and pound on the table and jump up and down and scream, that if they had the power, that they probably would exercise it. At any rate, the subject of radionics in this country was suppressed many years ago and declared to be an anathema, and therefore you hear very little about it. Now, it hasn't, of course, disappeared, and many people have made use of it for their own benefit or their family, friends, or whatever. And there are, on occasion, under-the-table practitioners who do work with people and are able to carry it on because of the very nature of how it works. At any rate, I wanted to give you a decent overview of it, and I'm not trying to convince you either way, other than the fact that you should be made aware of what is available. If there's something that's usable that you could make use of for yourself, then certainly you might want to do that. Now, I'm going to start from the quote scientific side first, in the sense that when you read certain pieces of information, you can know that they have to hedge because they're afraid if they took a strong stand one way or the other, then later it could be proven to be wrong. Then that makes them stand with egg on their face, so they think. And medicine, of course, has been guilty of taking strong stands over the years on all kinds of things, only to find out later that they were totally wrong in the position they took. But, of course, they just kind of ignore it and keep going as though, well, gee, maybe everybody will forget, and now we'll take our strong stand on something else. But at some point, maybe we'll do that. I've alluded to it at different times, but at some point, maybe we'll just do a broadcast on positions that have been taken by medicine that later have been proven to be either partially or totally wrong. And as I say, they've continued on with their head high as though it never happened, and continue to make strong pronouncements about things, which I think, I don't believe I would say that, because knowing what I know, they're probably at best only partially right, and in many cases totally wrong. So we'll talk about the scientific side. Now, as you start to investigate, and remember I mentioned the two big books, one, The 21st Century Radionics, which is one of the latest, and the other one was called The Secret Art, A Brief History of Radionic Technology for the Creative Individual. Those are both on the website. You can click and go to Amazon, and they are available, currently available. They were both, however, written from, as far as I know, authors from Great Britain. Now, in Great Britain, of course, radionics is not only legal, they have schools that teach it. There are practitioners of radionics. It is a profession. There are actually many cases where traditional medicine calls on practitioners of radionics when they get an individual, a patient, that has some kind of problem that they just cannot locate. And so there are some that work hand in hand with radionics practitioners. And as I say, there is a school program, there is a certification, and there is a practice of it. It's perfectly legal, and I'll tell you in a minute why it's perfectly legal there. And in fact, most cases around the world, it is legal. Now, when I start researching a subject, of course, I dig from all over the world, and not just now, but back for years. Recently, and it isn't really complete, but I've been involved over the last 2 or 3 years in studying the last 200 years of medicine, health, illness, and food, nutrition, the whole bit. And it's quite interesting what you bring up. So I've done the same thing with radionics, except I've gone way back, because it really goes a long way back, and we don't even have time to do like a decent history of dowsing, radiesthesia, radionics, which are 3 terms that you keep running into frequently when you get involved with this field. Now, it's interesting because I ran into a publication by the United States Department of Interior Geological Survey. This is an agency that they call it Science for a Changing World, and of course they use the initials USGS, which is United States Geological Survey. And the subject of this particular report they put out is called water dowsing. Now, it's interesting because if you read the report, they try to say that they're being objective, but the way they say it and the way they word it, you can tell they have tongue-in-cheek to have to acknowledge that there seems to be something to water dowsing. Now, that's probably the one thing that most people have heard about, is water dowsing over the years, and some people call it water witching or whatever, just depending on who it is that is talking about it and who's doing it. Now, there is an organization in this country called the Society of Dowsers, American Society of Dowsers. They're out of Connecticut. They've been around for years and years and years. They teach programs. They have a very broad membership, and a lot of people take the programs and or utilize the materials that they make available. And so there's, I would say, a high percentage of people that acknowledge that there must be something to it. I have done it. I know that it works. And I know some of the things that are leveled against it are not accurate because they have not actually watched it work. Now, there's been some research studies, and those studies indicate, well, you know, they have a pretty high percentage of accuracy, but then they turn around and try to backpedal as much as they can to say, well, maybe there might be something to it, and let it go at that. But they're really reluctant to come out and say, no, there's nothing to it, it's totally worthless. And so that's what this report called Water Dowsing. And as I say, it's by the United States Geological Society, or Survey, I'm sorry, not Society, Survey. And it's an official publication, and they talk about it as though, well, you know, maybe the people don't understand what they're doing, and they do what I call a lot of double talking, but bottom line is they kind of acknowledge that it exists, but they say, well, you know, there's other ways that science has been working on this problem of locating water, and it may not be as dramatic as the dowser, but you know, we're making headway. But what they're really saying is, well, there's a lot of cases we don't know. We can't find it. We don't know what to do. Might drill a lot of dry holes at a lot of expense and get nothing. Now, that was my experience. I'll tell you a personal experience of my own. And I'm talking about dowsing and radiesthesia, which is means sensing something from a distance, bottom line. My sister built a new house many years ago on a piece of property that was next to my parents' house. And I had found water at my parents' house and actually dug the well, my mother and I. And so my sister, a few years later, built a house next door. And then the next lot from her, another new house had already been put up. So this is out in kind of a country area outside of the city of Vermillion, Ohio. And so the people who built the house next door, they were finished with their house before my sister, so they brought in a well driller to drill a well. And so he kind of looked around and said, well, you know, maybe this is a good spot back here. It's behind the house, and it'd be a good place to have a well. So he drilled about 3 or 4 dry holes and finally said, I don't think you have any water. And let it go at that. So bottom line, the only other alternative at that time was they had to dig a huge hole in the ground, put in a cistern, and have water hauled in from the city all the time so that they could have water. So my sister said, well, you know, they haven't found any water there. Do you think that I am going to have the same problem? And I said, well, I don't know. So I took my L rods, my dowsing rods, behind the house where they drilled the dry holes, and sure enough, I got no response. And I said, well, there's no water back there. Now, that's not to say somewhere on that piece of property there is water, but there was none at the point where they drilled. So then I went to the back of my sister's house, and I did the same thing and got the same response. There is nothing there. So she said, uh-oh, I'm going to have trouble. I said, well, let me go to the front of the house. So I went out in the front lawn, or what was to become the front lawn, and I started my walking back and forth, and suddenly I got a response. And so there is a method if you get a strong water response. I backed off and came from different angles, and when I hit a certain spot, it reacted. So then there is a method of determining depth. And so I went through the procedure of determining how deep the water was. And if I recall, it was like 23 or 24 feet deep or something like that. So that meant that it was capable of being a dug well. And so after she got done, they hired somebody to come out and to dig a well. And down at the depth that I had doused, they hit water. And it was a strong supply of water. And as long as they, in fact, she still lives in the same house, that the well has never gone dry. And so I personally know it works because I personally experienced it, and I've used the rods for other things. Now, I'm only saying all this to say that it is a controversial subject, and I want you to know that there are two sides of it, and that when I speak favorably of it, it's because of having personally done it. But it's interesting when you read this article because, as I say, it's like they had to grit their teeth to acknowledge, yeah, it seems to work, but, you know, but they don't want to just come out and say, yeah, it's another option, and a very inexpensive option compared to having somebody come out and drill several dry holes and get no water. And so I was looking along, and I also located another big study that I thought was interesting. And it was called Unconventional Water Detection, Field Testing of the Dowsing Technique in Dry Zones. Now, this was done out of Germany under auspices of the Department of Physics at the University of Munich. The Germans are very meticulous people, and I thought it interesting that they came up with this. And at the end of it, they are forced to acknowledge that it works, but here's what they say. Finally, it must not be overlooked that the proposed model of integration presently tested by GTZ in a simple version during the Namibia program part 1.10 should be of great help in many other areas already prior to its more thorough scientific scrutinization. The rapidly growing water shortage in many regions of the world cannot be relieved or stopped within acceptable time by the application of presently available conventional techniques. Now, what are they saying? Okay, in all of our science, we don't have techniques that are capable of finding water in dry zones, and there is a problem. So, here's what their conclusion is. In addition to existing efforts, immediate use of the suggested integration model would enable a significant contribution to the advancement of water supply programs beneficial for many people. Now, what are they saying? Well, you know, we really don't have a way to do it, so in order to get some water to these people, I guess we should go ahead and make use of that. And then, of course, they try to cut it down a little bit in the next paragraph. In the long term, there is the possibility to substantiate the performance of successful dowsers by technically measuring procedures and optimizing accordingly prospecting methods. But it's funny because they just got through saying it seems to work, but now they're saying, well, you know, it could be studied more, that we could really substantiate it. And it says, and in this connection, it may be noted that in recent years, a number of sensory and analytical abilities of highest quality exhibited by biological organisms have been reconstructed by bionic techniques successfully applied. Now, what they're saying is, well, you know, we might be able to copy that into technology, and down the road we might be able to do pretty good with that. Of course, that's going to cost a lot of money and make a lot of money for a lot of people for the technology, but in the meantime, the simple process of a person walking along with a forked stick or a set of metal rods and finding water is a pretty hard act to follow cost-wise. That's about as cheap as you can get. But anyhow, they reluctantly have to admit. Now, if you probably followed the news in Vietnam, you know, they had a problem with the tunnels that were dug that were creating havoc for the soldiers, because the North Vietnamese would hide in the tunnels and then suddenly spring out and surround the soldiers and create all kinds of problems. Well, there was no way that they seemed to be able to find those tunnels, and so they brought in dowsers, and guess what? The dowsers were able to locate the tunnels. Now, they don't like to talk about that too much, but they were able to do that because with dowsing, you set in your mind what it is you're looking for, and that's what you find. Basically, what we're talking about, that human beings have tremendous traits that are not utilized as much as they could be. Now, because of the shortage of time, we can't get into the depth in this, but I'd like to mention a couple more scientific things. In Germany, there's an organization that has decided there's a lot of problems with dying vegetation because of the abusive use of pesticides and other toxins in the environment. And so large stands of trees many times are getting sick, and in many cases dying off. And so they decided, what can we do to solve the problem? And so they developed something called resonance therapy, and they have an organization, an international foundation called IRT, which their goal is to save the trees by applying some form of protection, detoxification, or strengthening of the trees. Now, we don't have time to get into it in detail. It's something you can look up yourself. However, the bottom line is that they use radionics and aerial photographs of the area, and they then treat those stand of trees every day for about 2 hours over a period of time. And what they've been able to do, now this is done from a distance. In other words, the trees were not where they had this institute set up. And they were able, over time, to regenerate the sick trees. And they have, of course, photographic proof of before and after testing, and nothing else was done except the treatment using the radionics. And in recent times, another group of people have come up with a more advanced form of radionics, and they've switched to that particular brand. But I'm familiar with both the ones they were originally using and the ones that are available now. And as I said, we don't really have time to get into depth, but this is valid. They've documented it. There's been studies written about it. And so that's from the scientific side. In this country, back along the way, there was actually an electronic engineer by the name of T. Galen Hieronymus. Now, I know that's an interesting name, and he developed something called the Hieronymus machine, which, of course, was named after him. And so what he did is, it was back in 1949, he applied for a U.S. patent on a radionics type device in this country. And the way he set it up, and I guess the reason it got through is because it seemed more innocuous than what the capabilities were. What he did, he set it up in such a way that he could take a stone or a chunk of a mineral deposit and put it on this device and step by step analyze all the different elements that made up this sample. In other words, he could do an analysis of it without having to do extensive chemical testing or nuclear magnetic resonance, which was very expensive at the time, and very few places had it. It was, at one time, a very elaborate piece of equipment. It took a whole room. I've seen the original big one, and it takes up a whole room. So anyhow, he was able, with a simple little table device, to analyze any material and tell you what all the elements were that made it up. And the interesting thing is, he proved it to the U.S. Patent Office, and they gave him a patent on it. But the bottom line was, it was a radionics device. And I thought it interesting. As time went on, a lot of other things happened, and again, we don't have time to get into all the details, other than to say it was not only proven that the principle worked, but it was proven and patented in this country, in spite of the fact that, of course, the whole medical and scientific community in this country, or I should say the scientismists, argue that it's all hogwash, it's the black box, which is where the term came from, a black box. Now, in England, along the way, the work that was being done here was carried over there. And so there was a scientist over there by the name of George Delawarr, D-E-L-A-W-A-R-R. D-E is separated and the L-A is separated. And his wife Marjorie. They were scientists, and they were kind of enamored by the principle because they were taught it by someone from the U.S. who traveled over there and was teaching some people about it. So consequently, they set up a laboratory to study it and study it in detail. And at some point along the way, they called in other scientists that they knew, and they likewise came in and did studies and found that it in fact did work, and that you could do a lot of things that I'm not even going to mention because we don't have the time to do it in depth, and if we don't, then it might be more confusing than helpful. But at any rate, they gathered all this data, and at some point, some lady, they made some of these devices, and some people bought them for their own purposes, to treat themselves and so forth. And one lady bought one, but occasionally there are people who have trouble using it because of some of the quirks of themselves, actually. And this lady had difficulty, so she said it was fraudulent, and she brought a suit against them in court. So it went to court, and Delawarr and a long list of scientists, well known and recognized in England, came and testified. Bottom line is, the court ruled that it was based on scientific principles and it was verifiable, and that this lady, it was a quirk with her that she had trouble with it. You know, the same as other things that people buy, other devices. Sometimes certain people have trouble utilizing them for whatever reason. And so it became established in Great Britain that radionics has a scientific basis. It does work and has been proven. And so you have practitioners in the school. So I'm only saying that what you hear about in this country is totally prejudiced, lopsided, and in most cases it's presented without giving you the total picture, if they even know it, and in most cases they don't even bother to look because everybody knows that it's a black box. It couldn't possibly do anything. So I wanted to lay that out first to make sure we got that in. Now, I mentioned before the book by Cleve Baxter, the researcher, called Primary Perception, Biocommunication with Plants, Living Foods, and Human Cells, and showed how things can be done at a distance. For example, taking cells from this doctor and taking them several miles away, hooking them up to a sensing device, and every time something happened emotionally to the doctor, instantaneously those cells reacted miles away, just showing connection, because we were talking about entanglement, and that is one of the principles from quantum physics you have to understand to make sense about how this works. You know, the box basically gets down to the fact that we're talking about a unit with dials of some sort that either dials in numbers in long strings or in groupings, or some other way of storing information. Now, I talked some last time about storing information, and that you can store information in various ways. And we talked about tape recording, storing a video, image, and sound on a piece of plastic tape with iron oxide, and that you can then take it back off and reconstruct. So you can store information, and so that's kind of what we're talking about in this whole thing, is the ability of information to be analyzed or expressed in terms of different storage systems and or ways of looking at it. And it all gets back, as I said, to quantum physics and entanglement. And I mentioned Dr. Radin, who's a physicist out of Great Britain, who wrote a book, Mind Entanglement. And there's many others that are out there. Fred Alan Wolf in this country, I mentioned him before, and William Tiller. All of these PhDs in physics and quantum physics have written a tremendous amount of material that will verify what is being talked about. But the medical community in this country has never even accepted quantum physics after a century of quantum physics, and still work on the Newtonian mechanistic model and fail to acknowledge and Fred Alan Wolf wrote the quantum physics years ago, The Body Quantum, showing how quantum physics actually works in the human system, and especially in the nervous system. But nonetheless, it never gets paid any attention to. Now, I mentioned to you about the course that you can get free on the internet. It's from a researcher out of Italy, Ruggero Moretto, and it's called Radionic Radiesthesia Practitioner Basic Course. And it teaches you how to make use of radiesthesia and radionics, and it gives you a lot of good information about it. Talks about the background of radionics, and it's as I say, for free, it's a pretty good course. There's almost 60 pages plus several index pages of graphs and charts and so forth. And it's on the website of www.biolifestyle, BIOLIFESTYLE, biolifestyle.org/EN. And if you go there, you can print out a copy free and give you a good background. It gives you some historical information. And this guy in Italy, I guess, has been using it for a long time and evidently teaches it over there. But, you know, I'd say he does a pretty good job of giving you a basic course if you're interested. Now, if you're not interested, of course, it's worthless. And he talks about the originator, which was Dr. Abrams, Albert Abrams, in this country, way back in the early 1900s, discovered the principles of the human body and information resonance and sometimes electromagnetic or scalar fields, and we won't define at this point. But the point was, he discovered that this was present, and he discovered it could be utilized to determine problems in somebody's body with using an instrument that was tunable to different informational patterns by setting certain groups of numbers together. And so he found that different elements had different pattern numbers, and therefore you could use that to determine if the person had it. Now, it also then had the capability of reversing that, meaning it could treat by inverting the numbers, the reciprocal of those numbers. It had a treating effect back on the person. Now, right away, if you think about it, you have a pretty good idea why it was opposed by the medical establishment, because by the early 1900s, they were getting pretty well established in the pharmaceutical field, and they could see the market coming and how much they were going to make, and they could also see, if something like this ever caught on, how much it might take away from their field. Now, of course, you know that wouldn't happen. There's plenty of sick people out there, and there's some people who would prefer to take something to make them well. So they may not even be a good candidate because they just would not feel good with it. And that's okay. But the point was, it would offer an alternative that was very inexpensive, didn't require buying a lot of expensive drugs at $1 a pill, or $10 a pill now, some of them are, and even 20. And it wouldn't require a lot of other factors. And so, bit by bit, I'm giving you pieces of information to let you know that there is information out there in the world that you can make use of, because you can do it yourself. They can't, at least at this point, they're not going to break down your house with a SWAT team and a SWAT team. And they're not going to break down your house and come in and rob you of your machine unless they thought you were helping other people with it. But in any case, you could still, at this point, do something for yourself if you found it something usable. Okay, so Dr. Abrams developed this whole thing. It was carried on further by another chiropractor by the name of Dr. Ruth Brown, who incidentally, they destroyed all of her equipment, put her in prison because she was doing a terrible thing. She was treating people and getting them well without them having to spend a pile of money. And we cannot have that. That's not good for the business of medicine. And anyhow, it was Ruth Brown also that went to England along with Abrams and got them interested in England. It's done all over the world. It's just that in this country, the medical establishment got hold of it early. The same as in France, the medical establishment got hold of homeopathy early and took total control of it, so that no one except the medical doctor can do homeopathy. That's one place in this country that's been a little loose up to this point. Who knows what might happen? It may change very rapidly, but I'm just giving you this information because the time is coming that things might be really, really tough, and you may not have access to treatment. So it's something you might want to consider for your own self to become knowledgeable, because it may be that if there are no antibiotics, the medical profession is out of business. And so what is someone going to do? Well, this offers a way. I don't even have time to give you all the implications of it, other than to say, look into it and look at these two books, The Secret Art and 21st Century Radionics, and then read others, because there's others that are out there. I have a considerable library that goes way back for many, many years. One of the big pioneers in it just died in the last few years, but his work is still being carried on, and I met him personally in England. His name was Bruce Copen, and he had been at it for years and years and years. He developed equipment, sold it, and I spent some time in his laboratory and spent some time with him. And just remember that we do communicate, and there's all kinds of things can be done with it. And I hope I've given you enough to perk your interest, because we've run out of time again. So be sure and go to the website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and also click from there to Alternative Health and Prevention. If you want to peruse all the pages on Mind Your Healthcast, there's all kinds of books, information, and things that you can do that can be beneficial to your health. So, till the next broadcast, be healthy.